Hey guys, it's Bella and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all having an incredible day. I'm sorry for leaving you in suspense yesterday with this case. So yeah, this is part 2 of the Anita COBBY case, which is one of the most infamous, notorious and disturbing cases here in Australia. If you guys haven't seen part 1, I will link it down below for you. I'm going to be telling you guys today about the lead that solved the case, the murderers, who they were, how they got caught, the timeline of Anita's last day, and a bunch more. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into it. So following on from part 1, Detective Rosetta, one of the lead detectives on the case, got a phone call on the 11th of February, and this is the phone call that would lead them to solve the case. In this call, the person said that 3 men, John Travers, Michael Murdoch, and Leslie Murphy, had stolen a car fitting the description of the one seen by witnesses in Newton Road on the 2nd of February, the day that Anita was murdered. John Travers' name had actually been mentioned to police in an anonymous tip in the first few days of the investigation, saying, look out for him, he's a sketchy dude, he's the kind of dude who could have done something like this. So John Travers, Michael, and Leslie were all in a sort of like group. Travers was the ringleader, he was 20 years old at the time. Michael was 18, and wherever Travers went, Michael went. And then there was Les, who was 22, and he was never usually far behind them. He was also dating Travers' sister. So when police heard they had stolen this car and could potentially be involved in Anita's murder, they brought the 3 men in for questioning. They set up 2 different groups of detectives and tactical teams to go and pick up the men once they located them. One group went to Travers' family home in Doonside. The tactical team forced entry using a sledgehammer and found Leslie Murphy hiding inside. The second group of detectives went to Travers' uncle's place in Wentworthville. They kicked in the front door and found Travers and Michael asleep together in bed. None of the men resisted, and they were all brought in for questioning. Leslie and Michael both admitted to stealing the car. They were charged with theft and were released on bail, but they were put under surveillance with undercover officers watching their every move. Travers also admitted to stealing a car, but he made some alarming comments about Anita. Like, police found a bloody knife when they arrested him at his uncle's place, and they brought it out and asked how he got it, and he replied, "I didn't slit that slut's throat." Very charming guy. And he said this even though detectives hadn't mentioned Anita's name once. Now, Travers actually had some rape allegations in Western Australia that he had been accused of previously, so unlike Leslie and Michael, police took blood samples from him and kept him in the cells at the station. While he was in the cells, he asked detectives if he could call his auntie so that she could bring him some cigarettes. His auntie is referred to as Miss X in this case, and she is Travers' uncle's girlfriend, the uncle that he and Michael were found in when they were arrested. And he was really close to them. He actually stayed at their house most nights each week. Detectives are like, okay, give us the number, we'll call her. They call her, and when she answers the phone, she's like, I need to talk to you about John. I haven't been able to sleep for the last 2 weeks, and I was actually going to call you. She asked to meet up with detectives to talk, and so they agreed to meet up that night at Wentworthville Leagues Club. Detective Rosetta and another detective met her there at around 6 p.m. and she was looking really uncomfortable, so they decided to take her to their unmarked police car to make her feel more comfortable, and she just completely opened up when she got into the car. She told them that she had a bad feeling that Travers was involved in Anita's murder, and he was really open with her. He told her about a lot of crimes that he committed, about sexual assaults he committed in the past. He hadn't mentioned Anita's murder to her, but she just had a bad feeling that he was involved anyway. So police were like, okay, can you please come down to the police station, give him his cigarettes, and we will put a tape recorder on you and you can just try and have a normal conversation with him, but see if he admits to anything involving Anita's murder. And this, by the way, is why she's called Miss X, because she agreed. She really helped the police out. She was getting death threats because of it from like him and some of his associates, and so she had to be put into the witness protection program. So a few days later, she comes in, she has the tape recorder strapped to her, and she goes and has a conversation with Travers. It's a normal conversation, but he opens up straight away. She asked Travers if he had sex with Anita, and mind you, it's not sex, it's rape, but you know, she was trying to have a normal conversation. She didn't want to tip him off that he was getting information. She wanted him to feel comfortable and open up. So she asked if he had sex with Anita, and he said that he had. He mentioned that 4 other men were involved: Michael Murdoch, Leslie Murphy, and Leslie Murphy's 2 older brothers, Gary Murphy, who was 28, and Mike Murphy, who was 33. They were all drunk, they abducted Anita, and he was like laughing, and Miss X had to be like, stop, it's not funny. Like, he had no remorse at all. He gave us some instructions. He's like, can you go to my house? Can you find my knife with the brown wooden handle? It's my best knife. It's the knife I used to kill Anita. And can you also find my jeans? They're really faded jeans. They have blood on them. And can you get rid of them as well? And can you go to Leslie Murphy and tell him to dispose of the car?
She was a former heroin user and knew Travis well. When asked why she would give up a relative, she said, no woman should go through what that lady did. Then when she came out, she basically collapsed into her arms. She was just absolutely shaking. She said, it's him, he's told me.
And she said that he'd done it? He told me he did it.
Take on, it's all right, come here. Take off, I got your smokes. I couldn't see it. It wasn't on the bench. Was it? I don't know how to put it. Did you have sex with her? Did you have sex with her? Did anybody else? All of them. Why did you have to stop up? Why did you have to do that? Come here, come close. We're all drunk. She fucking said all of us. Well, she saw your faces. And you knew. So what the other said you had to do it. Who said it had to be done? You. You all agreed. But that's not your thing, John. You haven't done that before, have you?
In this conversation, he even tried to like get her on board with an escape plan. So there's like this train station behind the police station. He's like, all right, here's what you're gonna do. You're going to derail one of the trains. It's gonna crash into the back of this building where all of the back of the cell blocks are, and I'm gonna leave. And then he's like, okay, that's probably a bit far-fetched. So can you just get Gary and Mike to come here with a couple of shotguns between 3 and 3:30 a.m. Hardly any officers on at that time, and I'll escape that way. Like, it was actually whack. Miss X then went and spoke to Michael Murdoch with the wire on, and he basically corroborated everything.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Murdoch. I didn't mean to wake you. I'm sorry. I just want to understand. You told me everything. I know everything. About what happened. I know it all.
And then after this, she, her boyfriend, Travis' uncle, and their 2 children were put into the witness protection program. And I thought I would just add that her boyfriend, Travis' uncle, was totally supportive of her. Like, when police approached him and Miss X approached him to tell him that she was working with police, he reassured her that she was doing the right thing, and he even helped her out. Like, the 2 of them went together to tell Les Murphy to dispose of the car, because obviously police had people watching him. They wanted him to lead them to the car, but even though they went and told him, he never went to dispose of the car. So after police get all of this information, they first go to arrest Leslie Murphy and Michael Murdoch. At around midnight on the 24th of February, they went in 2 groups to go and arrest these men. One group went to Michael's mother's house where Michael was staying, and the second group went to arrest Les in Granville, where he was found in bed with 2 women. Police then executed a search warrant at Travis' parents' house because he told Miss X that's where the knife that he used to kill Anita was, and the jeans with Anita's blood on them were, and they found several knives, and they also found the bloody jeans. 2 days later, on the 26th of February, police had found out where Gary and Mike Murdoch were staying through confidential informants. So at 10 p.m. that day, more than 50 armed officers surrounded the house that they'd been hiding out at in Glenfield. They forced entry with a sledgehammer and found Mike on the sofa with a woman and a baby, and Gary was standing behind them. Detective Kennedy pointed a shotgun straight at Mike and told him to get on the ground. He then put his foot on Mike's head while he was on the ground and arrested him. Gary tried to run. He ran through the backyard but was caught by officers when he got to the back fence, and he actually wet himself when he was arrested. So, I mean, If that doesn't show you how much of a coward this guy is, I don't know what will. So with that, in 22 days, all 5 men responsible for Anita's murder had been arrested and charged with rape, theft, and murder.
We were there when they brought them in. We were there when they'd taken the Murdoch and the Murphy to the crime scene, what they call a runaround.
Where we took them to the scene of the abduction. We took them to the scene where they dragged her through the fence. And then we took them to where the body was located.
It's a reenactment of the crime. They get them to explain what had happened.
So I'm going to give you a quick overview of who these men are, and then we'll talk about what happened on Anita's last night. John Travers was said to be the ringleader. He was 20 years old at the time of the murder. He was born and raised in Blacktown and was the eldest of 8 kids, and he grew up pretty poor. Apparently his father was violent with him growing up and allegedly sexually assaulted him. His parents split up while he was young, and he and his siblings lived with his mother. She was a single mother, and so he would beat his younger siblings to like whip them into shape. By age 13, he was smoking weed, and by 14, he was an alcoholic and had a reputation for violence and theft. By 15, he'd been expelled from school, and from then on, he'd spent a lot of time in and out of juvie. He committed multiple violent sexual attacks against both women and men, so he had a pretty extensive criminal record. There was also this really messed up event with a sheep, and if you don't want to hear what happened, skip ahead like 1 minute. It's not very long, but it's really fucked up. Apparently on his 18th birthday, he brought a sheep to a barbecue. He had sodomized the sheep. He then slit its throat and cooked it and ate it for dinner.
If I went and done a house or something and I saw that the people were living on bare necessities, I wouldn't take nothing. I'd just walk straight out the front door again. I don't do poor areas, I go to a rich area. So I know they got a bit of cash, they're all insured, it's not going to hurt them anyway. They'll probably claim more insurance, just taking off the richer for the poorer, like Robin Hood.
It can be hard, like, you know, particularly since he was living at home and I was on my own without my husband. He'd certainly whip the boys into shape more or something. I don't mean whip, I mean, you know, make them do as they were told or give them a biff on you or something like that.
What thoughts have you got for Anita's parents?
Well, I don't think there's a day that's gone by that I haven't felt for those people. To say sorry to them, I mean, there's nothing more you can say than sorry. It's not adequate. It's not enough. But what can you say? I mean...
Michael Murdoch was 19 at the time of the murder. He was one of Travers' childhood friends, and just like Travers, he spent a lot of time in and out of juvie, but he didn't quite have as long of a criminal record as Travers. Leslie Murphy was 24. He was the youngest of the Murphy brothers, although he had the worst temper of them. All these men were darers and had criminal records. Leslie had a criminal record for theft and sexual assault. His brother Gary Murphy was the one that peed himself when he was arrested. He was 29 years old at the time, and he had a criminal record for car theft and breaking and entering, and was also known to have a bad temper. And lastly, Mike Murphy was 34. He was the eldest of the 9 Murphy siblings, and he was actually a prison escapee at the time of Anita's murder. He was serving a 25-year sentence at the Silverwater prison when he escaped in December of 1985. So just 6 weeks before Anita's murder. So on top of the charges the other men got, he was also charged with unlawfully escaping prison.
In the early 80s, Reverend Fred Nile ran an outreach centre at this address in inner city Sydney. Nile was trying to turn troubled youths away from crime. Mick, Gary and Les Murphy were regulars.
I still remember the mother would ring up and say, this is an emergency. I think it was Mick Murphy. I want to talk to him. So I got him on the phone and I said to him later, what was the message? He said, Mum just told me if I've got a stolen car not to go home in it tonight because the police are watching the house. So he had a bit of a reputation for stealing cars.
So now that these guys have been arrested, we've got more of an idea of what happened to Anita the night that she was murdered. So we know that Anita took the 8:48 p.m. train from Central Railway Station to Blacktown Station, and at Blacktown Station, all of the payphones there had been vandalized, so she couldn't call her dad Gary to come and pick her up like she usually did. So she decided to walk the 2 kilometers from Blacktown Station to her parents' house, which took her through Newton Road. While she was walking down Newton Road, the 5 men were driving down the street and they were drunk. They were on drugs, they had been in a party earlier, and that's when they saw her. Travis told Gary, who was driving the car, to slow down as they approached her, and then he and Mick Murphy jumped out to grab her. They were beating her as they dragged her in, and she was kicking and screaming. When she was inside the car, they forced her to take her clothes off, and she was like, "I'm on my period, I'm married," and they didn't care. They started beating her. They took turns beating her and broke her nose, and they also took turns sexually assaulting her. They stopped at a fuel station on the Great Western Highway, and fuel cost about $15. They stole that $15 from Anita's wallet, and when somebody went in to pay, they all held her down so that nobody would see her if they looked at the car. The men then drove her to Reen Road in Prospect, which is where her body was found. They dragged her out of the car when they got there and dragged her through the barbed wire fence into John Reen's paddock, which I assume is why she had so many lacerations on her body from being dragged through that barbed wire. It's then assumed that they beat and sexually assaulted her for the next hour and a half based on the autopsy, only stopping for a brief moment when John McGoy's brother came with the flashlight and didn't see anything. They were there. They just stopped making noise because he was there. When they were done, there's obviously some conflicting reports about this because they were all kind of telling different stories, all kind of blaming each other. But some of them say it was a unanimous decision that they all agreed to kill her because she had seen them, she could report who they were to police. And some of them say that it was just Travis' idea, that he was the one that decided to kill her. Some of them didn't want to do it at all and told him to leave her alone, but he was like, nope, she has to die. Whatever the case may be, Travis was the one who grabbed her head, pulled it back, and slit her throat so forcefully that her head was almost severed from her body. It's believed that Anita died from blood loss within 2 minutes of the cut. The men then took her clothes and burnt them to destroy any evidence, and her body laid in that field for 2 days before it was discovered. The trial for the 5 men began on the 5th of March in 1987, and it was pure chaos. There was so many people gathered outside of the Blacktown police station just waiting for the men to come out for their transfer to the courthouse. And when the men were brought out and put into the cars to be transferred, the mobs literally surrounded them. Police had to drive through super slowly because there was people just crowded around the cars. They were rocking the cars. Like, it was crazy. There were tons of people who gathered at the courthouse. Temporary metal detectors had to be installed at the courthouse, and every single person who entered had to be checked by security. There were angry mobs outside with posters saying to hang the men, to not waste their tax money keeping these men alive. They actually had hung a dummy from a building, so it was pretty obvious the public was pissed and they wanted these men dead.
Let the public fix them! Kill the bastard!
By the time we got back to the station, I've never seen anything like it. This truly was a lynch mob.
It was little hairy moments. It was a big crowd. They were venting their rage.
And these were people, these weren't feral people. These were mums and dads and grandpas.
That's the little one that probably piddled himself. Look at the one in there laughing.
Oh, you'll be laughing on the other side of your face, scumbag.
You creep. You animal.
Yeah.
Mongrel. You just wait.
Walking tall.
Look at him.
Yeah, walking tall. You gonna live with what you've done?
It doesn't seem to upset you, but look at him.
At the trial, Travers actually pled guilty right at the last minute, which is something nobody expected. And then right before the trial began for the other 4 men, there was a news article that was released that basically revealed that Mike Murphy was a prison escapee, and all the jurors would have seen it, so the judge declared a mistrial. And then the second trial started on the 23rd of March in 1987.
We just hope that these people are put away so that they can't do it to anyone else. We wouldn't like anyone else to go through what we've been through.
I had no idea of how horrendous that court case would be. God. It was just shocking.
I won't go into too much detail about what happened at the trial because I already told you everything about the case, but basically the defense knew they weren't getting these men off. The case was too public, they were too hated, there was too much evidence against them, so instead they decided to try and get the murder charges dropped down to manslaughter. They said, you know, Travers was the one who killed her, these 4 men, they didn't actually physically kill her. They also tried to claim police brutality. They tried to claim that their confessions were beaten out of them and that they were given under extreme duress, but the judge was like, not having any of it. He was like, the police's actions were completely justified under the circumstances, so
There was a struggle and Gary Murphy's face was scratched up a bit. When he appeared in court, Gary Murphy's defence counsel had started to grill Ian Kennedy in the witness stand and said, how did my client get those marks on his face? Did you beat him up? Ian Kennedy, as a matter of fact, must have happened when I stepped on his head when I arrested him. Well, everyone in the court who heard that just went, you beauty.
And during the trial, the men were actually giggling and snickering at each other the entire time because they're just evil monsters who had no remorse. The trial ended on the 9th of June, and then the next day at 10:20 a.m. on the 10th of June, the jury came back and found the 4 men guilty of murder. The 5 men were sentenced on the 16th of June by Justice Maxwell, and she sentenced them to life in prison without the possibility of parole, so it's likely that they are never going to be released from prison. And the whole courtroom actually clapped when the sentencing was delivered. Travers, Mike and Leslie were sent to Goulburn Correctional Centre, which is like one of Australia's most infamous prisons. It's a super maximum security prison in New South Wales, and it's also where Ivan Milat was being held before his death. In 1996, Travers pretended he was sick, he faked an illness, and then when he was in the transport vehicle from the prison to the hospital, he actually used like a hacksaw to try and like escape. And in his time in prison, he's been in a bunch of fights with different prison guards and inmates. All 3 of the men were banned from interacting with each other, and they were also banned from interacting with other high-profile inmates like Ivan Milat. Mike Murphy actually had to go back for another hearing after the sentence because of his prison escape, and at this hearing, he actually was unable to sit down because he'd been assaulted by other inmates. Again, this is pretty graphic, so if you don't want to hear it, I'll leave a timestamp to where you can skip to on the video. So some prisoners held him down, they put a plastic tube into his anus, they then put barbed wire into that tube, took the plastic tube out, leaving just the barbed wire in there. He is the most isolated of all of the prisoners because of this incident, and not a lot is known about his time in prison. Gary and Michael Murdoch were or are moved from prison to prison like every 6 months because I think police were like scared of them like making a kingdom or something, I'm not sure why. But Michael Murdoch became a devoted Christian. For a while, he was declassified to a medium security prisoner, but then in 2015, the Sydney Daily Telegraph came out with this campaign that got him reclassified to a maximum security prisoner. Now, this case was obviously very high profile, so a lot of the inmates knew about it, and so these 5 men got beaten a lot in prison by other inmates. They actually had to spend a lot of time in solitary confinement for their own safety because they were just being beaten so much.
Today, Gary Murphy back in the headlines. The now 61-year-old taken to St Vincent's Hospital in a critical condition after he was bashed in Long Bay Jail. Good evening, Pete. Tonight, Gary Murphy is in a serious but stable condition. He is in intensive care where doctors are right now trying to work out whether or not he will need surgery. That Gary Murphy was only moved from Goulburn Jail to Long Bay Jail a week ago. We are hearing that the inmates who targeted him today aren't known for any significant crimes, and they also didn't use any weapons in the attack, just their bare fists. Pete?
Mike Murphy died of cancer at age 66 on the 21st of February in 2019, and when he died, Anita's father Gary said 1 down, 4 to go.
Michael Murphy died in Long Bay Hospital in February this year from natural causes, aged 65.
Regarding him, he can rot in hell.
And the fact that these most dangerous criminals die in jail, from a commissioner's perspective, like, I couldn't be happier, as macabre as that sounds.
And now I just want to quickly talk about what happened to John Cobby after the murder. He obviously didn't take it well, as I mentioned, and he turned to drugs and alcohol.
When was the first time you took heroin?
Possibly, I would think 3 days after her death.
Why?
Wanted to die, but didn't have the guts to kill myself. Just hoped that I didn't wake up one day. Every time I'd think about it, I'd get depressed and angry at the same time. Revenge was high on what I thought. It was crippling. It was such a negative thought. And I lived with that for years and years and years.
He ended up moving to America for about a year after the funeral so that he could avoid the media and avoid being reminded constantly of Anita, avoid being reminded of what happened to her. He had a family friend living in Michigan, so he went to stay with him, but had to leave when a reporter randomly showed up at the door and asked if he was John Cobby and if he could interview him. So he then went to stay at another friend's apartment in San Francisco before eventually deciding to return to Sydney. For the next month after he got back from Sydney, he slowly got clean, stopped doing drugs, stopped drinking, but he was still so overcome with grief that he just couldn't bring himself to do anything, couldn't bring himself to work. When the trial for Anita's case began, he had to leave again. He couldn't deal with seeing it all over the news again. He couldn't deal with the constant reminders. And so he ended up moving to London and staying with Leonie, if you remember, which was his girlfriend before he started dating Anita. They started dating, but it wasn't a great relationship. John just felt super guilty and depressed the whole time because he couldn't let Anita go. And Leonie felt really guilty because she felt like the only reason that she was dating John was because Anita was dead. And because of this, she would have nightmares about what happened to Anita. She had really obsessive thoughts about it, and it took her a really long time to be able to overcome that. After a while, they decided to go on a trip to Bali together, but this did not go well. John just felt so guilty because he and Anita had visited there a bunch. He felt really wrong being in a place that he and Anita had gone to with another woman, but he didn't have any money to get home, so Leonie asked her parents for some money and she paid for John's ticket back to Sydney, and they didn't see each other again. Back in Sydney, John started working in psychiatric nursing and he slowly got clean again. On the 23rd of January, he changed his name to John Francis because his last name just reminded him of Anita and he just wanted to stop being reminded of it every single day. In 1987, John met a woman named Elizabeth at a New Year's Eve party, and they ended up getting married 2 years later on the 16th of December in 1989. They had 2 children together. And in 1997, he actually visited Anita's grave for the first time. That same year, he actually got a job at Long Bay Jail, which is actually where Travers had been held before he was moved to Goulburn. And John's sister believes that John got a job there to try and find Anita's killers.
There was talk of a death penalty, calls for the death penalty. Is that something you would support?
Yes.
There's also talk now of a remote possibility that these men may sometime walk.
Yeah. I've heard that.
Do you think about that?
A lot. Makes me feel concerned for, not concerned for my safety. I'm concerned for my family's future and the repercussions of what might happen if they are. released.
Are you concerned what you might do?
Yeah. I know what I'll do.
What?
I'll do what should have been done 30 years ago.
And what's that?
And kill them all. Without hesitation.
In 2005, John and Elizabeth got a divorce. And this whole time, John never told his children about Anita until one day he was sitting down watching TV with his son Daniel, and then a special program about Anita came on and John started sobbing, and Daniel was like, "Why are you so upset over this random woman?" And that's when John sat his son down, sat his daughter down and told them, "I'm John Cobby, Anita Cobby was my wife." And then in 2016, John and his son Daniel went and changed their last names back to Cobby.
I wanted to let you know that tomorrow my father and I
are changing our
surnames
names
back to Cobby.
our original family name. Nothing can change what happened to Anita almost 30 years ago, but tomorrow we were taking a big step in the right direction to having a life with a touch of relief. This is a huge step individually and as a family. I couldn't be prouder of my dad and what he's achieved. Tough times don't last, but tough people do.
After the trial of the 5 men, a new organisation was established called the Victims' Compensation Tribunal, which would allow family members of murdered victims to claim up to $50,000 in compensation. John thought it was blood money. He didn't want any of it, but his sister eventually convinced him. He went and saw a forensic psychologist and was deemed deeply disturbed and was granted $25,000. Anita's parents, Gary and Grace, started a support group called the Homicide Victims Support Group to help comfort those who were grieving, and they worked on providing support up until their deaths, Gary in 2009 and Grace in 2013. In honor of Grace, Grace's Place, which is a trauma recovery center for children and their families, to help them with the loss and grieving caused by the death of a loved one through homicide, was established, and it is due to be completed in 2021. That is all of the information that I have on this case. I would love to discuss with you guys in the comments down below, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye guys!